Chapter 14. Memfoso. We attack the Amaya. Become enough of a nuisance that they send one of their cruisers after us to wipe us out. We'll need a convincing target. Maybe one of the bases we can abandon, or maybe we can use one of the old towns the Amaya used as a base while gathering resources. Circa 19 days, 23 hours, since the assassination of rebel leadership. Uchantu tried to keep her expression neutral and not to fidget as she waited under Lightside's red, relentless sun near Memfoso's rail station. It was one of a handful of towns, outposts, really, that the Amaya maintained along the mag rail lines they'd built on this continent, making it one of the only places the trains stopped before reaching the sea to the north. She and her other teammates wore local guard uniforms, stiff, uncomfortable things of red, white, and black fabric with yellow accents meant to imitate Amaya gold. Everything was going well so far, but Uchantu couldn't help feeling exposed out here. Vulnerable. She wished they could just steal the equipment the town used and be done with it, but then Memfoso's people, including their sympathizers who had provided the uniforms, would suffer. They would take some of it today, but they needed the distraction of the train for this all to work. Taking a deep breath, Uchantu leaned against one of the overhangs lining the railway to provide some shade and glanced over her shoulder at Memfoso. Uchantu had only seen the town a few times, but she'd never gotten used to it. She was surprised the Amaya hadn't lifted most of the older buildings here from the continent like they had so many other ruins and ancient structures. These were old, but had been well maintained. Most bore the ornamentation and more severe lines of the Iron Empire, as well as some Amaya sun and axe motifs. Those structures fit. The metal structures in the back, some tall, some squat, all painted white to reflect the sun and bearing at least one sun and axe motif, seemed to contrast everything about the ancient town and the rocky scrubland beyond. That made sense, though, as they were temporary modern buildings. In this case, that meant a few years rather than a few weeks or months. But Uchantu knew that once the Amaya saw no more need for Memfoso and its mines, they would pack up as much as they could and leave this area behind to crumble like the rest of Efremani. Checking around to make sure none of the real guards were too close. There were a few close by, but none within earshot. Uchantu reached up to her ear and activated the radio hidden in her helmet. Naruna, how are things going for you? We're all set. And the train is on its way. Good. Radio once they're on. Yes, sir. Uchantu took a deep breath. The plan was simple enough. The train would slow down on its way into Memfoso. Uchantu's people hid with Naruna near a rocky outcrop the train would pass when it was slow enough to board. Using the cars they'd stolen from their last raid, Naruna had trained Axeli, Gakengo, Chala, and Yoret in how to deactivate the coupling geororals. Once on board, those four would detach the cars, resulting in them being left behind a short distance outside Memfoso as the train's main body pulled into the station. That was when Uchantu would take over. Just as a low hum reached Uchantu's ears, the ground starting to rumble, her radio sparked to life. They made it! Uchantu smiled at Naruna's excitement before glancing toward a nearby guard and schooling her expression. Good. The rest of you stay hidden. Movement out of the corner of her eye caught her attention, and Uchantu looked over just as the train came into view. Footsteps to her right made her swallow, stomach clenching, but she kept her features neutral as she turned toward the approaching guard. The Natari man wore a uniform similar to Uchantu's, though with a sergeant's stripes on the shoulders, meaning he outranked her. Looks like we'll be needing to help unload soon, he remarked. Uchantu almost barked a laugh at the small talk. Swallowing her nerves, she nodded. I always hate that part. We'll be in the shade for some of it, though. The man grunted. Natari liked being in the sun, liked feeling its rays on their skin, but even they needed a break from it every now and then. Any idea what this one's carrying? Uchantu forced a grin. Mining equipment, I think. Overheard some talk about needing repairs. Other than that, she shrugged. That's above my pay grade. Uchantu tried not to tense as she noticed the man frown and study her out of the corner of his eye. What had she said wrong? Was it the pay grade thing? They do still have pay gaps, don't they? Uchantu knew the Amaya was big on wealth redistribution. Effectively putting that stance into practice had won them many allies before and even after true war had actually broken out. It would have made opposing them much more difficult if they hadn't used such cruelly efficient tactics when their diplomacy wasn't good enough. Most of the reports from their moles didn't include the Amaya's current economic policies, but Uchantu imagined there was still some sort of meritocratic consideration when deciding on what to pay people. At least they're stopping to give us and Axolmo some supplies before sending them off to Darkside, he said. Uchantu frowned at the officer's fishing. This train isn't scheduled to stop until it reaches Jedu after it leaves here. Or did the schedule change? He smiled, looking a bit too self-satisfied. Of course, my mistake. Even our efficient scheduling grows confusing sometimes. Before he or Uchantu could say anything else, the train passed by them, settling its length before the station, and Uchantu glanced to the side. There. Do you see that? She gasped, pointing the way the train had come. The sergeant frowned, then stiffened as he noticed the disconnected cars. Scarlet Light! Before he could give any orders, Uchantu started in that direction. You secure the train, sir. I'll go handle that. She whistled for a few of the other guards, most of them her people in disguise, to follow her, then took off at a run as soon as she saw the officer wave a few other guards to him as he jogged toward the head of the train. As she closed in on the detached train cars, Uchantu fell in with her team. Arena and Okada made no indication they knew her other than a small salute, but Uchantu allowed herself a small smile. They would take care of the real Amaya guards soon, but Uchantu wanted to be far out of earshot and have the cover of the cars before they did anything. If Yarn and his people are ready, that part should be done in seconds. All the guards with Uchantu were Natari, or Natari presenting, at least. Their sympathizers with Memfoso and general intelligence told them that most Samyati personnel in the Amaya were sent to Darkside rather than being posted on Atonga or anywhere else on Lightside, so anyone wearing a light cover would draw too much attention. Uchantu had posted that part of her team with Naruna, ambushing the train and hiding among the cars, and with Yaren near Memfoso's mine and the entrance to Iron Peak. When they reached the cars, Uchantu turned to the group of guards that had come with her and took a moment to assess them. 15 had followed, and there were 4 groups of cars that had come undone. I want 3 per group, Uchantu barked, pointing to the tracks. She'd been given the uniform and faked insignia of a corporal, so the regular guardsmen would follow her orders without question. Maybe that's why the officer was suspicious. Would I be paid enough to know that sort of thing? Uchantu shook the thought from her head. That didn't matter at the moment. As the guards started to move toward the track, she pointed toward Arena and Okada. You two, with me. Both flashed quick grins as they fell in with her, lagging behind the other guards just a bit. From Arena, that surprised Uchantu, but she tried to see it as a good thing. Everything is going as planned. We just need to get through this. As the groups of guards reached their respective sections of cars, each one no more than 3 or 4 long, Uchantu quickened her step and grinned as she heard a grunt and a few thuds from the first group, then silence. She and her companions continued past that group, glancing over just long enough to receive a salute from her people, before continuing toward the next group. When they reached the last car, Uchantu smiled and activated her radio as she made her way back toward the station. Good job, Naruna. Help them secure these cars and wait for the signal. The easy part was over. Now, Naruna and her team would search the cars, ensuring the equipment they needed was there. Once that was done, they would work out of sight to reverse the polarity on the geororals on the bottoms of the cars, then wait for Yarn's team's distraction. As Uchantu noticed the officer from earlier jogging toward them with a handful of other guards, she dropped her hand and clenched her fists. They would need that distraction soon. Corporal, the officer said as he came to a stop before her. What's the status on those cars? I've got the men working on them, sir, Uchantu said, saluting. Looks like the wiring on the geororals wasn't as secure as it should have been. One of the men is apparently familiar with the frameworks and said they would have the cars recoupled within a quarter of an hour. After that, all we need to do is push them back toward the rest of the train. The officer looked past her toward the cars, then nodded, gaze returning to her. Good. Make it 10 minutes if you can. After that raid last week, an explosion shook the stone beneath them, ripping through the air and drowning the man's words. A cloud of dust and dark smoke billowed up from just beyond the town. That's the mine, Uchantu gasped. The officer looked to her, eyes wide. Uchantu nearly told him to go check it out, but she'd already come too close to giving him an order earlier. Do you need me to assist with that, sir? Uchantu asked, hand on her sidearm. The officer looked between her, the column of smoke, and the train cars, then shook his head. Uchantu covertly turned off the safety and unbuckled the latch. Secure those cars and get the train out of here, the man ordered. We'll ask Diadu to offload them and send back what we need once the town is secure. Yes, sir. Once the train is gone, come back to the mine. But make sure the town is secure on your way. Leave a handful of people to make sure none of the citizens are hurt. Uchantu saluted, then looked after the officer as he jogged off with his soldiers. That was the sort of thing that made what they did just a bit harder. What made her glad for Estingai's order not to kill unless absolutely necessary. Despite all the horrible things the Amaya had done and continued to do, it cared for the safety of its people, or its soldiers did, at least. Uchantu turned back toward the cars with a sigh. She was about to radio Naruna when the other woman spoke first, voice crackling in her ear. Uchantu, we have a problem. You need to get over here. Tense from Naruna's tone, Uchantu waved to Arena and Okada as she set off at a jog toward the last group of the cars. They got there just in time to see 2 speeders of Imaya troops pull up on either side of the tracks. Starless Knights, she thought, even as Arena cursed. Perke. Was this from someone on my team? Something Haruxi did at Last Shadow, or just bad luck? Taking a deep breath, Uchantu steeled herself and approached the soldiers as they climbed out of their speeders. These were soldiers, not guards. Their uniforms were more practical, and they wore body armor and carried sidearms and short swords at their waists, with rifles strapped over their backs. They also carried themselves with more confidence than the guards. Rather than deter them, Uchantu tried to think like a low-paid guard who probably hadn't seen much combat in her life. Thank the light you're here, Lieutenant, she said, saluting as she approached the rank of the most important-looking woman in the group. She looked Uchantu up and down, then returned the salute. Corporal, what's going on here? Where is Sergeant Akane? At the mine, sir, Uchantu said, assuming that was the man she'd spoken to earlier. The train pulled into town and a few cars came uncoupled. I was here investigating it when some sort of explosion went off in the mine. Expression grim, the woman nodded. Command made the right call sending us over here then. This is a rebel attack. She turned back to her soldiers and listed off 6 names, then pointed toward Memfoso and the mine. Those 6 hopped back onto their vehicle and sped off toward the mine. Uchantu looked after them for a moment, then turned her attention back to the officer, expression smooth as her stomach clenched. Her fingers twitched. She itched to conjure some hard light. That's what I thought, sir. It looked just like an issue with the Geororals coupling the cars together at first, but after the explosion... Did you have a tech determine that? Uchantu blinked at the woman's interruption. Sir? The lieutenant frowned, folding her arms as she glanced at the cars. Then Uchantu and her companions. Her soldiers began fanning out as they approached the cars, dividing into groups. There were only 24 of them, but they were armored. Armed with rifles instead of sidearms and truncheons like Uchantu and her people. And they could be Auroramancer's. I read over the files of those stationed here, so I knew what I would be working with if anything happened, the lieutenant said. I don't remember anything about any guardsmen being skilled with Geororals. Did you call in someone from the town or the mine? Beside Uchantu, Arena stiffened. A few of the soldiers were almost between the cars where their people were. Calm down. We can handle this. Uchantu shook her head. No, sir. I looked at it myself. I haven't been formally trained, but Geororals interest me. When I have time, I look at the speeders or various devices, and it's obvious that these use emeralds and plates of obsidian to link together with enough slack to allow for the tighter turns the rail sometimes takes around rock formations like this. I don't know if it was the only factor, but when I checked, it looked like a few of the wires weren't pressed against the biogems firmly enough to activate the coupling or keep the proper strength. Probably just some wear and tear over time. The lieutenant narrowed her eyes. All cars and Giorolo components are inspected when the trains reach the destination, with components switched out if needed. That's standard procedure. Even a corporal such as yourself should know that. Uchantu nodded, resisting the urge to wet her lips. Her throat had gone dry, too. Yes, sir. Even inspectors make mistakes, though. The lieutenant shot Uchantu a sardonic expression. True enough. She looked past Uchantu for a moment. What of the men you have between the cars? Pardon, sir? Do they also have an interest in Giororo technology? Or are they idling in the shade, despite the explosion at the mine? Did you send someone for a trained technician to recouple the cars? Uchantu's stomach clenched at the edge the woman's voice carried. Arena and Okaada shifted. It's a pretty simple fix, Uchantu said, so I told them what needed to be done. I'd gone back to the station to report to my sergeant and request a tech, but then the explosion happened. The woman's expression grew more skeptical as Uchantu continued. I don't know if he requested the tech. Our orders were to recouple the cars and get the train out of here as quickly as possible. I was on my way back when you arrived. The lieutenant nodded, but said nothing. Her gaze traveled from Uchantu to each of her companions, then past them to the cars. What was your name again, Corporal? The lieutenant said. And the names of your men here. Uchantu hesitated just long enough to seem nervous, but not conspicuously so. It gave her a moment to remember Okaada and Arena's aliases. Corporal, a small projectile, almost too fast to track, slammed into the lieutenant's shoulder. Uchantu's eyes went wide. Even as the lieutenant cried out, Arena lunged, flying past Uchantu to knock the woman to the ground. She landed flat on her back, dust billowing up from beneath her. Uchantu was so shocked she nearly waited too long. She brightened her gem crest, conjuring a dome of hard light around her, Arena, and Okaada the moment before shouts and gunfire erupted from both sides. Once she had that up, she slammed a block of hard light into the fallen officer's head to make sure she was unconscious. Arena! Uchantu gasped, straining to hold her hard light. Closer! Now! Arena blinked, then looked down at the Amaya officer she crouched over. Arena! The woman shook herself, then hurried back to Uchantu. With a sigh, Uchantu reshaped the hard light into a smaller dome. She still strained as the enemy fire pelted the shield like wind-blown rain, but it would hold. I have that under control! Arena shook her head. She was onto us. She would have had her soldiers surround us, or one of the others would have been caught, and she would have made us. Uchantu clenched her teeth. She wanted to yell at the woman. Instead, she let it out in a sigh. That can wait. Uchantu looked toward the soldiers on either side of them, then the cars. She activated her radio. Yaren, we're under attack. There are soldiers headed toward the mine. Take what you can and get out of there. Get to the Iron Peak entrance if you can, but only if no one is following. Naruna, are you and your team all right? I'm inside one of the cars, she said, voice tight. I don't know about the others. Uchantu's jaw bunched. If I take care of the soldiers, can you hook up the cars so that I can pull them with a speeder? Yes, but that would be too slow to get that far, wouldn't it? Can you do it? Uchantu snapped. Yes. Wait for my signal. She switched channels. Yaren, take care of that speeder. Take it or make sure it can't follow us. Yes, sir. Uchantu winced as the strain grew even greater. Looking to the soldiers, Uchantu saw the two groups had closed in. The one near the end of the train had left their speeder unattended. Taking a deep breath, she looked to Arena and Okaada. I'm going to split the shield and push it toward each group. You run after it, take shelter between the cars, then take care of those soldiers. You got it? Both nodded. What about you? Arena asked. Uchantu nodded toward the half-dozen soldiers between her and the speeder. I've got them. They nodded again. Ready? Both crouched, turning away from her. Uchantu focused on her hard light. Go! The gunfire immediately grew louder as she broke the dome, reducing each half to a curved wall just tall enough to shield herself and her companions from harm, then roared with the effort of pushing both as far and as fast as she could, even as she sprinted toward her group of soldiers. Luhuta? Edendo? Uchantu, the woman's voice crackled. What's going on? Get over here, now, Uchantu snapped. We need evac. Yarn's at the mine or the Iron Peak entrance. The rest of us are by the train cars. On our way. Uchantu waited until her wall came within inches of the soldiers before her to look back. She didn't see Arena or Okada, and her wall was past the first opening between cars. Satisfied, Uchantu pushed on both hardlight walls even harder. She looked to the group of soldiers behind her and bared her teeth. As they braced or tried to scramble out of its path, Uchantu split her wall down the middle, reshaping each piece into a block she slammed into the soldiers. When she strained from resistance against the wall behind her, she shoved it away, then dismissed that construct, focusing her attention on the soldiers before her. The soldiers behind her wouldn't risk firing on their own, and they would have enough to deal with in a moment. The men and women before Uchantu didn't stay down. She'd surprised them, but hadn't hit them hard enough to knock them out. She didn't have a wall to slam them against like she had the guards in the train car. A spike of fear shot through Uchantu as the closest one raised his rifle. Uchantu had never gotten over that. But she trained herself to press forward instead of flinching away. A small bar of hard light pushing against the barrel sent his shot wild, and Uchantu jumped, following up with a knee to the face that landed with a crunch. Uchantu sailed over the man, sending him to the ground, and threw up another shield as she formed a tonfa in each hand with wide shields that would cover her arms. She'd never taken to the acrobatic fighting style Matsanga had trained them in as much as Estingai, but she still had the strength to do things like jumping high enough to leap over an Atari man. Bullets hammered against Uchantu's shield. Instead of strengthening it, she ducked, widening her arm shields as she held them up before her and shattered the wall-like shield into 100 pieces, then shot them toward the 5 remaining soldiers. 2 of them leapt out of the way. 2 more stumbled back as she clipped them in the shoulder or leg. The last fell to the ground as shards of hard light pelted his entire body. He wasn't dead. Maintaining an edge on hard light was difficult enough when it was just a single piece, much less dozens of shards. And she hadn't put enough force behind them to damage any organs. It would have hurt, though, despite the man's armor, and Uchantu was certain he wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. Leaping up from the ground, Uchantu closed on the nearest soldier. She slammed the blunt point of her weapon into the woman's stomach, then followed it up with an elbow to the side of the head that sent her to the ground. Uchantu pivoted as she regained her footing, lunging toward the next soldier. He got a shot off, but it grazed her shoulder armor. Still, it threw her off balance. Uchantu spun to avoid stumbling, and when the soldier blocked with his rifle, Uchantu kneed him in the back. The man cried out as he fell, and Uchantu grabbed his rifle and threw it toward the next soldier. The woman had been about to fire, but the shots went wild as she dodged. By the time she recovered, Uchantu was on her. She knocked the rifle up, kneeing the woman in the stomach. Even as the woman stumbled back, Uchantu followed up with 3 quick strikes. Once more to the stomach, one to the sternum, and another to the back of the head. As the soldier fell, movement to her side caught Uchantu's attention, and she dismissed one of the tonfas, reaching for her sidearm. She drew and fired in one smooth motion. Her first shot caught the man in the shoulder. His armor stopped the bullet, but shocked him just long enough for Uchantu to get off her second shot. It took him in the calf, dropping him. Uchantu winced. She didn't like shooting people. Even a through-and-through like that would take a while to heal and retrain the muscles. He was down, though, clutching his leg. Uchantu stalked over to him and kicked his rifle up with her toes as he reached for it. You're alive, Uchantu spat. Count yourself lucky we're not the monsters you are. She brought the butt of her rifle down onto his helmet, knocking him out before he could respond. She'd rather not have done that. Getting knocked out was terrible for one's body, especially from a blow to the head. But she had to make sure he didn't get to the speeder. Uchantu glanced around to make sure the others were down, then crouched at the rapport of a rifle further down the uncoupled cars. She hesitated for a moment, about to drop the rifle, then holstered her sidearm and slung the rifle over her shoulder before running toward the gunfire. Uchantu leapt over the track, rifle ready as she sprinted for the fight. Her eyes widened as she took in the men and women in guard uniforms pressed against the side of the cars. 2 crouched behind them. 3 lay on the ground. Those weren't moving. Starless Knights. Uchantu forced down a lump in her throat and sprinted even faster as ice pierced her stomach. Those were her people. Dead. How many others are between the cars or up ahead? An Amaya soldier peeked around the corner of one of the train cars, firing wildly. Uchantu threw up a barrier before her, just in case, but kept going. Darkness, what I wouldn't give for gray nodes right now. Her heart pounded with the effort of running this fast, but she knew she'd trip or tear something if she tried to go any faster. As she closed in, the Amaya soldiers fired again, and one of her people stumbled back. Andor, no! He caught himself, though. Clutching his thighs, he knelt down behind the last two standing. Uchantu hoped one of them was Arena. Just as the Amaya soldiers grew bold enough to burst out from the cover of the cars, Uchantu reached her people. She threw up a hard light shield between them and the Amaya, sprinting past her team toward the enemy soldiers. A few of them fired at her. The others jumped out of the way as she and her shield careened toward them. Uchantu used the same tactic she had before. Just before she reached the soldiers, she broke her shield apart and thrust the sections toward each individual. It cost her. She was down to half her aurora light, and she knew she'd have a splitting headache later from concentrating on so many constructs at once. But it worked. Even as Uchantu knocked the soldiers back, she didn't let up. She barreled into the closest one, using her shoulder and her momentum to lift the man off his feet and send him sprawling. She fired on the one to her right, all shots center mass. He fell. Uchantu spun and fired on those behind her, throwing up a shield to block any shots they might have gotten off. Nothing hit her, and the Amaya soldiers fell even as they leapt for cover. Uchantu felt no joy, no satisfaction in killing these soldiers. Just a ball of ice in her stomach that sapped the rest of her of any warmth. Despite what she'd told the other soldier, she knew these men and women weren't monsters. Some of them might be cruel or hateful, but most were just normal people who had been fed enough lies by the Amaya to believe what they were doing was right. Taking a deep breath to help steel her nerves, Uchantu tore her gaze from the dead soldiers and jogged back to her people. Arena was one of the two still standing. Okaada was the other. She activated her radio. Naruna, are you all right? For now, the woman said. Wamba and a few others fought off the soldiers outside. Now they're in the car with us. All of them? Naruna was silent for a moment. Fetheret is gone. Uchantu hissed a ragged breath. Uchantu? She shook her head. Just get over here, quickly. Yes, sir. Uchantu looked to Arena as the woman stopped before her. I'm glad you're okay, she said, looking to Okaada. Then she frowned. Who did we lose? Arena's face was a mask of pain as she listed off the names. Uchantu swallowed. How bad are the others? They live, Okaada said. But they're out of the fight, and they need to get back to base soon to make sure that doesn't become permanent. Uchantu frowned, but nodded, then looked to Arena. Run back to the speeder and bring it over here. We might be able to salvage this. Arena nodded and sprinted back the way Uchantu had come. As she did, Okaada looked past Uchantu and perked up. Uchantu followed his gaze to see Naruna's team and the others jogging toward them. Two carried bodies over their shoulders. Uchantu's fingers twitched as she took them in, and her chest tightened. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing it away. No, I need to get us out of here. Just as Naruna and her people stopped before her, a mechanical hum reached Uchantu's ears, and she sighed as Arena pulled up beside them in the Amaya speeder. At least this part might go right. Uchantu looked to Okaada and Arena, pointing to the speeder, wounded and fallen in there. She turned to Naruna and pointed at the uncoupled cars. I need your help hooking these up to the speeder so we can pull them away down the track. We can do that, right? Naruna nodded, voice muffled by her mask. I should be able to, if we have the right components. Make it happen. How many cars can this pull, at top speed? Naruna thought for a moment. Down the track? As many as we need. Once we need to leave the track, it depends on the terrain. Uchantu nodded. They could worry about that part when they came to it. She looked to Naruna's team. I need these cars linked together, all of them. We need the equipment inside, and we don't have time to get these ready for the transports to carry out. Move it. Even as her team moved to follow her orders, Uchantu's radio crackled. Yaren spoke into her ear a moment later. Uchantu? Yaren, what? We've been made, he said, sounding out of breath. She heard screams in the background. We've got some of the equipment inside, but I couldn't hold off the Amaya for long. We need to get out of here. V2. Edendo's on his way, Uchantu said. They should be here in minutes. Can you hold out that long? Yes, he said, but the entrance,
The Amaya saw us. The guards, we might have been able to take, but with those soldiers backing up?
Destroy it.
What?
Destroy the entrance, Uchantu snapped. You have Chala with you, right? See if she can pull down the entrance. If not, set off an explosion inside. The Amaya might be able to dig out the tunnel at some point, but we'll be gone by then. His radio was silent for a moment.
You know this means Iron Peak is burned, right? Even if we don't destroy the entrance, they saw us going in. My people will have to evacuate.
Uchantu's throat tightened. Send one of your team through to warn them.
Yes, sir.
And Yaren?
Yes.
I'm sorry. He didn't respond. Uchantu hadn't thought he would. Taking a deep breath, Uchantu turned back to the speeder and jogged over to Naruna. How's it going? Not good, she said, crouching behind the speeder. I think I need to detach a coupler from one of the cars and fix it here, but I don't know if that will hold. Can you do it? Naruna shrank. Uchantu's radio crackled before she could ask again.
Uchantu?
Lahuta, where are you?
You have more Imaya incoming.
Uchantu tensed. From which direction?
North. We can still retreat down the rails.
Uchantu gritted her teeth. How long do we have?
3 minutes. We'll be there in 2.
Uchantu cursed. Make it 90 seconds.
Done.
Uchantu looked to Naruna. What can you do in less than 2 minutes? Naruna shook her head. With these? Nothing. I'd need a power drill. I don't have that. Uchantu clamped her jaw shut to keep from cursing again. Estingai would have had one on her belt. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to think of something, anything she could do to salvage this mission. There wasn't. I failed. The thought chilled her, nearly paralyzing her. But it was true. She'd failed. Uchantu let out a ragged sigh, shaking. A few seconds later, she heard the roar of the transport's engines on the wind. She looked around to her team, then activated her radio, turning it to all their channels. Everyone board and get out of here. The Amaya is on its way with reinforcements. Uchantu yanked Naruna up, then helped her into the speeder with the wounded and hopped in beside Arena. We have 60 seconds before we need to be out of sight or else we risk being followed. The mission is a loss. Let's go home. Arena's expression darkened, but she brightened the engine and whipped the speeder around as Missouri and Luhuta touched down their transports for boarding, then sped off south. The sun beat down on them, hot despite the cool wind whipping by their faces. Uchantu felt only the ice within.